Inquisition, that when they were testing people to see whether you were Christian or Muslim or Jew, or whether you were a believer in three gods or one, they would test people, and if you failed the test and you were a believer in one God, you could be burnt at the stake, or in some cases you were made a galley slave. And so on the boats of Columbus and Da Gama and Balboa and these early so-called discoverers, we call them conquistadors, conquerors. On these boats were Muslim Moriscos. They were Muslims who were hiding their identity. And also there were Morenos, who were Jewish people who were hiding their identity. And these people made up part of early America. They were part of the society here. And it's amazing when we bring this out and we see even individuals who reached high levels were part of these societies where Muslims actually were involved. The next major wave to come across is in the Atlantic slave trade. And slavery itself is a concept which is misunderstood by many, and it is one of the tools used to create the wrong image about Muslims, to create Islamophobia. So we need to step back a little bit and to look at slavery in its roots, to try to understand what slavery is, and then what was the role of Muslims in this, and what came out of that. Slavery itself was a worldwide institution. In the same way we have boss and worker, employer, employee. In the ancient world, you were either master or slave. There's no in between. And so there was slavery in China, there was slavery in India, in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, in the Middle East, all over. Every country had this concept of slavery, the people who were subjugated and the people who were conquerors. And even the word slave itself comes from Slav. You know, Slavic people, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, right? So the Romans were taking the Slavs as their slaves. That was the main source of their slaves. It was not Africa. It was Germanic countries and Slavic countries. So the term sort of stuck. This is a Slav, or it's a slave. And we are using the word slave now in the way it was used before. Now, probably the most well-documented, famous form of slavery in the ancient world was Roman slavery. Because the Romans had developed a highly organized society. They had conquered many lands. And they had integrated the people into their society. And plus, there are different writings and inscriptions of the Romans where you can still see how they dealt with their slaves. One historian, or many historians believe that slaves actually made up more than half the population of Rome. So more than 50% of the people in the Roman society were actually slaves. And the slaves were not considered to be citizens. They were not considered to be full individuals. And you'll see in some of their drawings, you will actually see when they do the drawings, and the small people here are actually the slaves. And these were not midgets. They weren't just short people, but that's how they depict them. So when they make a picture, a full citizen gets a full body, and a slave is depicted as a half person or as a midget. So you'll find this in Roman slavery. Now, the sources of slavery, there are many different types of sources in the ancient world. Slaves could be gotten by kidnapping, where you come into a village and you literally kidnap children. Debts, people had to pay their debts. Sale of children. Up until today, in some parts of the world, in parts of India and other parts of the world, they actually sell their children through poverty. Slavery could also come about for crimes. So as a way of punishing somebody, they didn't, in many cases, they didn't have prisons. So they'll make you a slave, and the people accept the fact that they're a slave, and they generally live in that type of lifestyle. It could come through lineage too. If your parents were slaves, and the children born to parents in many societies would also be slaves. But the major way in Africa and Asia and in the Arabian Peninsula was through warfare. And that is that after a major battle, you would have prisoners of war. And so what would you do with the prisoners of war? The Romans, who had one of the best armies in the world at the time, so they had a lot of prisoners of war, a lot of slaves coming in, constantly coming in. They literally made a marketplace. They made a business out of this. So they had huge marketplaces where you would buy slaves, and according to the skills of that slave, they would test the person to see, is it from upper class or lower class? Is the slave literate? What does it have? So they would deal with you like a horse or a piece of property. According to the value of that slave, it would be the value of the price. So people would literally own it in the same way as you own horses. And so this is the way it was in many parts of the world. In Africa itself, and in Arabia, it was mainly warfare. You found warfare and prisoners of war where people are coming in. And you also have domestic slavery. And that is another form where usually a female will enter into a home, and literally you don't have to pay anything. That person's your slave, and they work and serve you. And the Romans went to extremes where you would have one Roman woman, have 3 slaves around her who just take care of her. So she doesn't have to lift anything. The slaves are actually doing all of the work. And so when Islam came, the last form of Islam came on the scene, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, as the last messenger, Arab slavery could go to extremes. You could have one person owning 26 slaves, and when he dies, his son would inherit all of the slaves, including his mother, if she was a slave. That's how perverted it could actually get within the Arabian Peninsula. And so Islam came in to Arabia with an extreme form of bondage and servitude. And you see that Islam is basically phasing it out. You cannot come along, it's impossible to come along like today. You can't come along and say there are no more employers and employees. Everybody's just going to work. That's not going to happen, because there's some people who have wealth or they have abilities, right? And they will be the ones who will start the business, and then they hire other people. So you can't just say, you come along and say there's no more employees. So similarly, Islam did not come and abolish the concept of slavery, because that was the way people dealt. But what it did was basically phase it out in stages to move toward the time when there would be no slavery. So this was a systematic phasing out of slavery within the Islamic system. And the word slave that is being used, when you hear the word slave being used in Islamic literature, really how we use slave, what we understand a slave is, it's not even the right word. Because if you say slave to somebody today, you think of somebody in chains or somebody being beaten and tortured. But within the Islamic system, when you have prisoners of war, there was what I would call controlled, bonded servitude. So the person was a servant, but there's controls. There's controls. They cannot be tortured and brutalized. They can wear the same clothing as the master, eat the same food. It's humane treatment, and there are ways to come out of it. If they had, in some cases, the Prophet ﷺ even allowed people, if they would teach, say, 10 people how to read, then they get out. That's called manumission. And so there were ways to come out of it. So controlled, bonded servitude. This you'll find continued. And the servant was called milkul yamin, or right-hand possession. So this is the terminology that was being used. So that is not the harsh slavery where the person has no personality, no rights, nothing. No, it's completely different than that. And so the Prophet ﷺ set the example by freeing slaves. He freed Zayd. He freed all the slaves and servants around him. And you find that Zayd ibn Haritha radiallahu anh, he actually went back to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and said that I would prefer to stay. Instead of going home to my family, I will stay with you because I love you so much. You treat me better than my father. So he was freeing the slave. The Quran itself, in many cases, was giving direction that if a person breaks their oath, free a slave. If you break your fast intentionally, free a slave. There are different issues that were coming up. So the whole thrust of Islam was freedom. Right? It was the gradual movement toward freedom. And during the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there were no slave raiding going on. In the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, there was also no slave raiding going on. Okay, so this is the best generations, and that is the essence of what Islam stands for. And this point is very, very important if you ever get into discussions with people, because in many cases they will say, well, you Arabs, the Arabs were the slave traders. They even try to say that the Europeans bought their slaves from the Arabs. But that's a lie, because as you'll see in West Africa, where most of the slaves came from, there were no Arabs in West Africa. So that's a lie. This is a distortion. And so slavery was being phased out during that period of time. Now, the Atlantic slave trade, and this is the major slave trade which concerns us. The Atlantic slave trade, this is when the powers in Europe now, remember the colonial powers who had conquered the Muslims, they got the technology from Al-Andalus. So the Portuguese, the Spanish first, and then the French, and then the British, right? So the technology started to spread. And so they went to the oceans to use this technology to try to subjugate the world. And when they developed their colonies in the Americas, and the areas on your maps, if you can see it here, if it's clear, the areas where it is that orange color, like Brazil, that is the Portuguese territories. The area of green is the Spanish territories, right? Yellow is the French, which includes right up in our area where Quebec. The dark orange color, that is the British. And the dark green is the Dutch, and that's mainly here in Suriname, which is Dutch Guyana. So you will see, based on this map, the ports in West Africa, going right from Senegal, the Senegambia region, around Nigeria, all the way down to Angola. These are the ports that the slaves were being taken from. And when the colonists first came to the region, and they settled, and they found the native population there. Now remember, 75 million people were living in the Americas. The problem that happened immediately was the people did not have the type of resistance in their bodies to resist some of the diseases that were coming out of Europe. They had just gotten over the bubonic plague, which is the worst that has ever existed, even worse than Ebola. They had just gotten over what they call the Black Death, bubonic plague. But they also had chickenpox, measles, smallpox, cholera, syphilis, all types of diseases they were coming because the cities were very crowded, the hygiene was not good. Rats are carrying it around within their societies. And so when they came over on the boats, they were coming sick. And when they landed in the Americas and made contact with the people, the viruses were spreading, as we see how a virus can spread. And the virus spread to the native people. The native people did not have resistance. They didn't have these diseases. Because in the Americas, they had fresh water, open space. The Americas, it's a huge space. Europe is a very closed place. So they had a lot of air, and they had animals running around, and, fresh food, right? Good environment. They didn't have these type of diseases. So they were dying rapidly because of the diseases. But the colonists said, maybe what we should do, because we need cheap labor. We need somehow, we have these huge tracts of land, and we want to grow tobacco or cotton or sugarcane. How do we grow it in a cheap way so we can make money fast? So they said, well, one way is let's catch the Indians, the natives, and we'll make them slaves. So they started making the native slaves to work the plantations. But that didn't work because this was their land. This is their territory for thousands of years. And so their resistance was they would just sit down and they wouldn't move. And you can beat him, you can do what you want, he's not going to move. When he gets a chance, he runs and escapes. And if he goes in the woods, you can't catch him because that's his woods. So slavery was not working amongst the natives. They tried even to bring thousands of them down into the Caribbean when they had killed all the people on some of the islands. They tried to bring them from America down to the Caribbean, but that didn't work. Then they tried to make the poor Europeans to be slaves. Because amongst the European, there is upper class and lower class. And so the lower class people, they said, let's make them slaves. Let's make them the ones who will do the hard labor. But that didn't work. Because the poor Europeans, they came to America for liberation. They came for freedom. They came to have a new chance in life. Only to be made a slave, that's not going to work. Plus the fact that they looked like the master, if they put on his clothes, learned some etiquettes and whatnot, they could be upper class. So that didn't work. So finally they looked to Africa. Because in Africa you have a dark-skinned complexion people who is easy to identify. If they run away, you know exactly who they are. They can't put on your clothes and hide, right? Easy to identify. Also coming from strong organized societies. They had the same environment as the southern part of the United States, the Caribbean, and Brazil. Tropical environment. Their societies were thriving, so they knew how to grow cotton. They knew planting. They were really organized societies in West Africa, as we learned when we looked at Mali and you look at Songhai and the great empires. So if you can get people out of there and make them work for free, then you will have somebody who has strong resistance, easy to identify if they escape, and also a lot of skills. So they put full force into taking slaves from Africa, and that is the Atlantic slave trade, which went from about 1500 to about 1870 or so. You can make just a generalization. That's about 370 years that this slave trade went on. And it was a wicked triangle between the European capitals, West Africa, America's like a triangle. And this is how Europe became powerful. This is how they expanded so fast. Because when the slaves died, you just get some more. You don't have to worry about workers' rights, workers' compensation, unions. You don't have to worry about anything like that. If they die, you just bury them and buy some more. So that was the intention, and this is how they carried it out. And there were millions of people who they actually brought from Africa. The sad thing for the African continent is that they succeeded in playing one tribe against another. There were no Arabs down on the West Coast, but there were warring tribes. And so when one tribe has prisoners of war, instead of just integrating them into society and making them, their domestic slaves or their workers, the Europeans came on the coastline and said, you give us your prisoners of war, we'll pay you. We'll give you guns, we'll give you different types of trinkets, whatever. And so they said, fine, take them. And then they built forts on the coast. And they intermarried. And a mulatto population came, a mixed African-European population came, who did the work on the coastlines. And so millions of slaves went through this what they call Middle Passage to the Americas. And the shocking thing now, which is coming to light, is that somewhere between 15 and 30% of the African slaves and political prisoners who came to the Americas were Muslims. Now, for many years, up until only about 30 years ago, the common understanding is that the Muslims were the slave traders. That's what they use against us. And we trade the non-Muslims. But the reality is, Muslims were also being captured and taken as slaves. And you'll see that they made movies. They made one in America called Roots, one called Amistad, which was a rebellion on a boat. There's presently playing in Canada a book called The Book of Negroes. It's playing on television, and it actually is talking about slavery. And the heroine of the movie, I haven't seen it myself, but I heard that the heroine, the girl who's the leading actor in the movie, she's actually a Muslim in the movie. She's a Muslim. So that's how identifiable it is, and it is known now. It's no longer hidden. They would never do that before. But now it is so well known of the Muslims who came into this hemisphere that they even, they're having it straight up in the movies. And so this is a deep background that we have. And this is a wave of Muslims now coming into the Americas. This is probably the most significant wave that is coming in terms of numbers, coming as political prisoners and as slaves. The first Africans to be brought into the New World, the Portuguese brought them from Senegal, Gambia region. And in 1522, the Wolof, they were bringing these Wolof, Senegambians, Latinos, Bozales, they were calling them. And they brought the Wolof into Puerto Rico and into what they call Santo Domingo, in these regions, which is now Dominican Republic and Haiti. They brought them into those regions there. But the Wolof, if you know people from Senegal, they are very proud and strong personalities, really strong. And so when they brought them into the region, they had problems. They had serious problems. And the Wolof made, who were Muslims, basically completely Muslim, they made slave revolts. And so in 1522 in Hispaniola, which is now Dominican Republic and Haiti, there was a major African slave revolt led by the Muslims. Also in Puerto Rico and in Panama, slave revolts. So the Wolof were leading these. And it reached the point where the king of Portugal actually made an edict. He made a law, and he said, no more Muslim slaves. He said, don't bring them because they're too much trouble. If you go south down by the area of Angola, which is further south, you may find Islam didn't penetrate all that region. So switch to Angola. Switch, and then around the other side by Mozambique, right? But especially from the Angola side, this is the main area. Switch there, because then you'll get non-Muslims, because the Muslims would not tolerate finding themselves in a position like this. And so this was the general understanding, that Muslims were small in numbers, right? But they were there. But now it's changing. Eyewitness reports, written documents, autobiographies, records, all types of things are coming to the surface. Even they found whole Qur'ans written from the memory of a slave. They found books of fiqh, Maliki fiqh, because remember how we looked at Qayrawan in Tunisia, right, as the base where the Maliki school was developed, and then it went across North Africa, and then into Al-Andalus, and also with the Murabitun down into West Africa. So Maliki fiqh is the primary jurisprudence there of the slaves who were coming across. And they even found sections of the Risala, al-Risala, of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, rahimahullah. This is one of the more famous Maliki fiqh books. So they found that in America, portions, the person is a faqih, he's a scholar, and he's recording Maliki fiqh, and from memory, he's writing like the Metan, okay, which is the basis of the Maliki fiqh of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani. And so, from these different reports that they found, they now start piecing it together. And the surprising thing is that they found them first, they found them in some of the islands in the Caribbean, then in the United States. They start finding them. And then now in Brazil. So in Brazil they are finding a lot of documents to show the presence of Muslims amongst the slaves. And some amazing stories are actually coming out from this documentation, and from what they are finding of those people. This that you see on the screen, is an actual document. These is how the documents will look. And so these are actual documents. They write in the Maghribi Khat. It's like the Moroccan script, similar that you find, in Timbuktu, and then all the way up into North Africa. Right, so these documents are actually coming there. Is there a question?
No, I just want to make a comment. A lot of people might wonder, 300 years you had people coming from Africa, 20%, 30% of them were Muslims. So what is it, why is it only a little bit of knowledge is coming through that we see today? And I just wanted to point out that the slave masters, they had what they call slave codes. There were certain things that a slave could not do. And one of the biggest things is slaves were supposed to stay illiterate. You, as a slave master, could not teach a slave to read or write. You could beat a slave, you could kill a slave. There would be no harm to you. But if you would teach a slave how to read or write, they would put you in jail, or beat you, or other things to you. That was one of the biggest crimes that you could do, was teach a slave how to read or write. Next thing was, no slave could speak in their indigenous language. So if a slave came to a plantation, they would make sure you would separate the ones who would speak your same language. So nobody could communicate with another slave from their own environment. And also, they even got it to the extent that you could not practice any of your cultural practices. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't play a drum, because a drum was a very effective way of communication among West Africans. So they forbid a drum or any other kind of musical instrument that would be able to communicate amongst the people. So okay,
so we're going to go on. Give me more in the question period, because we want to keep the flow of this going now. And so this was, as was mentioned by our brother, that it was a harsh form. It was one of the most brutal forms of slavery that ever existed. Because these codes, especially what they call Code Noir, which is the black codes, because in the beginning there were some people amongst the colonists who were actually Africans. And they were amongst the early 13 colonies. They were free people who had somehow, come on the boats or whatever, and they were Africans. But when the Code Noir then came, which changed everything now, this is like, 17th century, this is changing slavery into color. So it becomes a color thing. And this was the most dangerous form that ever existed, because their intention was not only to make the slave imprisoned physically, but also to imprison the person mentally. And the other problem is that the slave masters, especially the slavers who were taking people on the boats, they had conscience. They were human beings. And some of them couldn't justify within themselves what they're actually doing. And so the whole issue of the color came into the dictionaries, and it came into the whole lifestyle, until anybody of color, of African origin, would suddenly be, you become a slave. And probably one of the worst things that they did was to put slavery or put color into religion. And this is where they depicted Jesus Christ, Isa alayhi salam. They depicted Jesus as a European-looking person, when actually descriptions of him, he was a Semite, he was a Semitic person. They depicted him as a European person, and by saying this is God or the Son of God, right, then a person who looks like that is God-like. And by depicting the devil and evil forces as dark and black, then one is good and one is evil. And it even came into the dictionary where they would, terminologies, for instance, if you say white, they're changing the dictionaries now. But the dictionary before would say white equals innocent, pure, and holy. So if you say, for instance, white magic and black magic, because white is innocent, pure, and holy, and black means dirty, evil, depressed. Okay, so if you have white magic and black magic, what's the difference between the two? What's the difference? What does white magic mean to you? Does anybody know? Good magic, right? If you say black magic, what does that mean? Evil, right? So you're putting value to the color. You see? If I was to say, you know, today is a Black Wednesday, what do I mean by that? Very bad day. Okay? Something negative happened. They're changing it now. I think they have one Black Friday or something where they have sales on. They're trying to change it now because of the racism thing was so heavy.
The arrows will not over everything becomes black, like blackmail.
Right, blackmail.
Yeah, that means anything that
Negative.
is black is bad.
Right, and then they say, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. And you have a person in Georgetown, Guyana, a Christian, who will say, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. But there's no snow, man. How are you going to have a white Christmas in South America in the jungle? But they don't mean that. What it actually meant was, I'm dreaming of a holy Christmas, an innocent Christmas, a pure Christmas, because that's what the term means. Okay, and that's the reason why, and that is a big issue now in America today. And to understand what's happening in America today, in Ferguson, Missouri, this stop and frisk in New York, and then I can't breathe, you know, these things happening in America, right? To understand that, you have to go back to the slavery period, because that's where the mentality is shaped. And so the person who is dark or black, right, from that class is guilty. And then you got to prove that they're innocent. But the person who is lighter skinned or European, that person is innocent until proven guilty. See, it's a different concept. That's the reason why if a young guy with pants hanging down, a baseball hat, walks along, and he's walking along the street in their walk, and he's a little European boy, the police look at him and say, okay, get along. If it's a black boy walking along like that, they stop him, right, because he's guilty. So that is how racism is formed, right? And so this color concept that came into the slavery at the time, you know, it was a devastating thing, what it did. You know, we're still suffering, you know, from the results of this up until today. We're still suffering from it. And the Muslims that were there, despite the fact that they were Muslims, were caught in this. And through these codes, also, they break down your religion immediately. Right? You can't practice your religion. If they catch you fasting in Ramadan or making salat, they will beat you. They might burn you at the stake, torture you to death. If you speak your native language, if you speak Arabic, they catch you with Arabic, you're really in trouble. And so this was a way to suppress the religion and force everybody to accept Christianity, change the names of the people, separate the families, and so then you will have a group of people who have no identity, who have no background, and it's easier to control. So that is the legacy that we are fighting up until today, and it still affects our society today, where the color of your skin actually has an impact on how people think. And up until now, this issue of color and race, it's in the movies up until now. There are a few African Americans and African Caribbean, whatever, who may make it up. There's a few of them, but predominantly most of the heroes will be a person who is European person. That will be your main hero in most of the programs. If you find somebody in the movie who is Chinese, have you ever seen a hero of a program who's Chinese? Yeah, Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee, right? That's stereotype. Because it's not everybody in China who's a kung fu artist. It's only the people who study it. This is the issue of stereotyping, right? That's what a stereotype means. Okay? Have you ever seen a person of Indian descent as the hero of a movie on television? Think about this. But how many millions are in the world? Have you ever seen a hero? And Gandhi is Gandhi. That's Gandhi. That's India. Have you ever seen a Malaysian person on television? Have you ever even seen a Malay on television? No. But most of your heroes would be of European origin. So that is the concept now that they developed through the Atlantic slave trade. It's a concept of racism, right, that we are suffering from up until today. It has not ended. We're still in, this concept of superiority and inferiority. So we will take a break with this and have Salatul Isha, and inshallah after Salat, I will come back and finish. Wa billahi tawfiq.